Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 15th chapter of You Either Die a Villain or See Yourself Become a Hero, written by FantasyFreak_2 on AO3. Villain AUs are my beloved, so we must heed the trigger warnings before we proceed. This fanfiction is for mature audiences with canon-typical violence and a trigger warning for abuse, suicide, murder, bullying, and discrimination. If that isn't your style, then I recommend Shades of Green, which is written by Maybe It's Friendly on AO3. It can be found on my channel! Canon Divergence is the name of the game, with this tale of Class 1A being a class specifically for rehabilitating villains in the making. With that being said, the chapter summary is as followed. A harsh fight starts between 1A and the villains Kurogiri brought into the USJ and the Nomu. Will they manage to survive? Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 15. Fight. As Ida managed to run out of the exit, Izuku heard dozens of footsteps coming up the steps towards them, and realized that the villains in the plaza were still there since Izawa had turned away from them to help 13, and the villains hadn't been as affected by the stun gun like Shigaraki and Kurogiri since they stood far away. Kachan, who seemed utterly unimpressed by the stun shot that Izuku had fired, which wasn't surprising considering loud and bright were part of his quirk, seemed to have realized it too. "The small fish are coming up the stairs. You extras go deal with them while I take care of this Nomu thing. It seems to be tough." "Okay," Yaoyorozu answered and rushed to the stairs. Several others followed her. Todoroki stepped next to Kachan and used his ice to freeze the Nomu to the ground. "I'll stay here and help you." Kirishima ran to Kachan's other side. "Me too. I can take a punch best out of all of you." "I don't need any fucking help," Kachan shouted and used his explosions to propel himself at the frozen Nomu. Shinso ran up to them and tried to get the Nomu to respond to him. Unfortunately, the Nomu didn't seem to have the cognitive capacity to even form words. After several failed attempts where the Nomu just ignored him, Shinso ran to the stairs, his capture weapon in hand, to help Yaoyorozu. Uraraka knelt first next to Aizawa and then next to 13 and used zero gravity to pull them away from the walkway and into the grass next to it, where she hid them between two trees that stood next to the exit. It wasn't a very good hiding place, but it wasn't like she had much of a choice. Izuku had managed to pull himself together and crawled next to Shigaraki and managed to pull out the quirk-suppressing handcuffs that Support had put on his belt. Shigaraki tried to push his hands away blindly, but Izuku managed to cuff him without getting disintegrated. Then he pulled the villain away from the fight that had already started between the Nomu and his classmates. Izuku wished he could get away with throwing him down the stairs where Yaoyorozu had managed to construct a cannon with which she shot the approaching villains, but the chances of Shigaraki just hitting his head wrong and dying were too great. Instead, he pushed him into the grass a bit away from the walkway and turned around to see if he could help his friends. Saro used his tape to try and fish Kurogiri down from above them and failed several times since his tape just went through the mist, but as he looked ready to give up, his tape managed to connect to something and he pulled it down. He blindly grabbed it and his hand landed on a metal chest plate that was swimming in the middle of the smoke. Izuku threw his small heat gun to Saro and said, "Threaten to cut him in two if he tries to move or teleport." The heat gun was actually only used to break open small locks or fences, and he doubted it could actually do what he threatened, but Kurogiri didn't know that. Izuku heard a hard impact next to him and spun around to see Kirishima, who had apparently been thrown so hard into the ground that it had dented around him. Izuku feared he had been seriously hurt for a second, but then the hardened form of Kirishima managed to get out of the hole with only minimal problems and immediately plummeted back into the fight with the Nomu. After a moment, Karchan was throwing explosion after explosion at it while dodging attacks, which wasn't too bad since Todoroki had frozen it to the ground again, but the Nomu barely seems to register the attacks. Next to the fight, Izuku saw a severed arm of the Nomu encased in ice, but the creature had 2 arms attached to itself. A regeneration quirk? At the stairs, Yaoyorozu looked very exhausted and started to run out of cannonballs. Mineta threw his lilac balls at the villains, but his skull started bleeding. One of the villains with spikes coming from her hair seemed to have changed sides and fired them at her companions, with Shinso standing next to her, probably controlling her every move. But he had a nasty cut over his eyes with blood running in his eyes. Everyone seemed to get more and more exhausted. Izuku didn't know where to go to help. The Nomu fight seemed more dire, but his classmates at the stairs seemed about to be overwhelmed. In that moment, the Nomu managed to break out of its ice cage to lend a straight hit to Karchan, who was flying into the air over Izuku's head. Karchan! Izuku turned around to help him once he fell to the ground, but Karchan never did. 2 strong arms had managed to catch him beforehand, and he was held to a broad chest. It was... All Might! Izuku whispered. The hero smiled at him and carefully put Karchan down. Don't worry, young Midoriya. He then ripped the tie from his neck and said with a far louder voice, For I am here! Izuku's classmates turned around and he saw the relief in their eyes. It's All Might! At the same time, the villains that were pushing up the stairs seemed to falter in their steps at the sight of him. All Might plummeted at the Nomu, throwing it down the plaza and starting to beat at it, but Izuku didn't have time to further look, because one of the villains coming up the stairs had thrown a spear at Sato, who managed to dodge it, but the spear ended up hitting Sero instead, who was knocked off Kurogiri, who immediately used his advantage to teleport away. He appeared next to Shigaraki, who was still fighting with his handcuffs. Shigaraki huffed at him, louder than he spoke before. Apparently he was still affected by the stun gun. Get me out of these things! I'm very sorry, but I don't have the ability to pick locks, Kurogiri answered, also rather loudly. I think we should retreat and regroup to attack at a later time. No, Shigaraki said. I may not have managed to get the brats on my side, but I can at least watch the symbol of peace get annihilated by my Nomu. Just get me away from the brats and down there so I can watch. Karchan stormed forward to stop them, but they vanished before he got to them. He huffed, frustrated, then turned around to Izuku, Kirishima, and Todoroki. I'm going to help All Might. You help the others at the stairs. I doubt All Might would need any help. Kirishima disagreed, but Karchan didn't listen to him and instead used his explosions to catapult himself over the villains at the stairs. I'm following him, Todoroki said, and used an ice ramp to also jump over the villains. Kirishima looked frustrated. Fine, don't listen to me. He and Izuku rushed to the stairs, where only a few villains remained, but several of their classmates looked ready to collapse. Yaoyorozu and Denki had already been pushed to a side, away from the fighting, since Yaoyorozu was unconscious, and Denki seemed to have fried his brain considering he was holding his thumbs up with an empty grin on his face. Izuku used his gun with narcotic bullets to shoot the man in the face that was right now fighting with Jiro, but he had to stumble backwards as a woman saw him and started shooting lightning from her fingertips. Kirishima got between them already hardened, and after the lightning stopped for a second, Izuku looked out from under his shoulder and shot. He missed spectacularly and cursed as he had to duck back behind Kirishima to avoid the next round of lightning. Luckily, his second shot hit. He heard a "release" behind him, and suddenly several blocks of stone that had been loosened by the fight and brought into the air by Uraraka fell down around him, hitting other villains. Aoyama stumbled backwards and fell to his knees, holding his stomach. He was right next to Tsuyu and Mina, who were battling a big man with a glowing shield and sword, and every time they moved, Aoyama was in danger of being hit. Izuku put his narcotic gun away and instead got out the gun with the grappling hook. He threw it out and managed to hook it into Aoyama's costume, then tried to pull it back, but his classmate was too heavy. "Give that to me!" Sato appeared next to him and single-handedly pulled Aoyama out of danger, but collapsed afterwards himself, his sugar rush being over. One by one, Izuku's classmates withdrew until only Kirishima, Tokoyami with Black Shadow, and himself remained in the front lines. Although, maybe you couldn't call Izuku front line since he mostly hid behind his two classmates and occasionally looked out and shot at their attackers. Since the stairwell was rather narrow and he had a clear view downwards even after an amateur like himself could manage to hit most of the times, but... "Guys, I'm running out of bullets!" Kirishima was breathing heavily. I don't know how long I can keep my hardening up." Dark Shadow is becoming tired as well. In the plaza under them, there was a hard battle between All Might and the Nomu, but Izuku couldn't concentrate on that. "Well, complaining about it won't help us," Izuku said and bent down to pick up a metal pole that laid next to him. Kirishima yelled out in pain in front of him and collapsed. Izuku used a metal pole to wildly swing at whoever stood over Kirishima, and miraculously managed to hit, but another villain pushed forward and Izuku fell backwards onto the stairs. The villain was on top of him in an instant with their hands on his throat, and suddenly he knew what Mr. Aizawa had felt earlier. Izuku tried to claw at the hands that held him down, but they wouldn't let go, and black spots started dancing in front of him, and the loud bang of a shot echoed next to him, and suddenly the hands were off of him, and he was dragged backwards by Snipe. The hero looked down at him worriedly. "Everything okay with you?" Izuku couldn't bring out a word and just nodded. It was probably better this way, since Present Mike used this moment for one of his shouting attacks, and Izuku doubted Snipe could have heard him anyway. Izuku had problems concentrating on anything. There was still a ringing in his ears and black spots in front of his eyes. He didn't know how much time was passing. It could have been seconds or hours, but suddenly Nezu was standing in front of him and his fallen classmates, and there was something in his eyes that looked like regret. In his small paw-like hand was a small mobile phone, and he was holding one of his fingers above it, as if he wanted to start tipping. "You are all very brave today, and I hate to do this to you after all of this," Nezu said sadly. "But I have to follow protocol." And he pushed his finger on the phone. Izuku felt a small needle extend from the bracelet he had been forced to wear as a member of 1A. It had been meant as a control measurement, so they could track them or suppress their quirks or knock them out if they did something wrong. And as the narcotic rushed into Izuku's veins, he recognized that according to protocol, using their quirk to defend themselves against villains was apparently wrong. But at least, Izuku thought as he slowly sunk into unconsciousness, at least Nezu and the other teachers seemed to think it was bullshit too. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you have given me. When recording that last section of this chapter, I actually had to pause recording because I didn't see the twist coming and was seething with rage of my own. The class fought so well and then they got drugged for their efforts. That's fucked up. All credits goes to the original creator of this fanfiction, FantasyFreak_2 on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel, and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah.